So welcome to the media panel. We have an august group here this evening, and we're going to do this panel just a little bit different. We met a couple of times over the last few weeks and decided that we're going to have everybody, with one exception, kind of sit in their seat. We're going to do a quick 3 to 5 minute overview from each of the panelists. We have our own set of questions that we may start out with once we're done with the 3 to 5 minute introductions, depending on what all gets covered here. And then in the end, we will turn this all over to the audience for questions, as has always been the case with the cards or on the website. It was suggested to me that maybe some of you have not paid attention to the website address, where you can go to get information about what's going on here and or to ask questions. So that address will be up there as soon as Mark finishes his presentation tonight, so that if you haven't seen it, that's the address you go to look at the agenda, look at bios, look at whatever. So there it is, right behind me. This is a hot mic, you notice that, so I don't have a problem here today. I think it was Bethany in an earlier presentation was talking about you can do everything exactly right in terms of a response, nail it, have all of the T's crossed and the I's dotted, but if you haven't communicated what you're doing to the public, then all of that might not get you as far as you would hope. This media session is near and dear to my heart. I don't think I mentioned this morning, but I have served on both the Exxon and Deepwater spills in various capacities, and have watched how significant the media is to the response in so many different ways, and how much the media and its interaction has changed from Deepwater. We had comparatively string and cans for Exxon compared to what was going on at BP. So this, I think, will be a great panel, and again, we encourage all of you for questions. So we have everybody lined up in order of how they're going to speak. First is Charles Wolforth, Alaska science writer, deeply involved in Exxon Valdez, and somebody I ran into on a regular basis. That Alan, I think you know, already been up here, but has some very distinct ideas about the media and how that should work. Mark Schroep, freelance author and editor. Justin Kenny, senior director for comms for Pew, but he was the comms director for NOAA during the Deepwater. Ann Thompson, I'll bet a lot of you know her, NBC Universal. She was telling us that she was 5 months in the Deepwater down there in the trenches. I did not realize she was down there that long. And finally, Sean Carroll, U.S. Coast Guard Chief of Response, but communications expert for the Coast Guard. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Charles, and we'll take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and it's good to see David again after all these years. I was 26 years old when the Exxon Valdez oil spill took place. I was a reporter for the Anchorage Daily News, and we kind of mobbed the story. I was there right from the beginning and was in Valdez through that summer and covered it for a couple of years, and then went on to start a freelance career from that, which I've been doing ever since, and have been writing books since that time, including a book that talks a lot about my Valdez experiences called The Fate of Nature. And my work is really focused on how society perceives and responds to environmental change, which is a science writing topic that relates science and culture. And I'm going to submit to you that as much as the media is disliked and it feels like we don't do that great a job, in fact, it's critical and maybe the most critical element of what we're all talking about today. In fact, I don't think we would be here if not for the media. Going all the way back to Gary Shigenaka's slides from Pennsylvania, which we probably wouldn't know about if Ida Tarbell hadn't written about them as a muckraking journalist around 1900. And then The Santa Barbara spill in '69 was such a huge turning point for our country. And I look around at the agencies that are represented here that did not exist until that spill took place, and Earth Day, and it started the EPA, started the Clean Water Act. And I'm sure that there were a lot of oil spills before that, right? But for some reason, that particular one caught the media's attention and became a national issue. The Exxon Valdez had less impact, but did have, the OPA 90 law came out of it, and I think a lot of environmental awareness resulted from it because of those images that were so searing and emotional. So it wasn't really the technical story that impacted, but the emotional story. And I've been thinking, and I'd love to talk about what the impact of the Deepwater Horizon was nationally. It felt to me like our society's changed, media's changed, and maybe the impact is different. Maybe it's more personal and less governmental and less societal. But it certainly, we didn't get a Clean Water Act or an OPA 90 out of it. The job of the media is pretty basic in an oil spill. Just asking some basic questions. What happened? How bad is it? And who got hurt? Whose fault is it? And what is being done? And is it working? And the media has a really different role there because most everybody else has some of those questions they don't necessarily want answered. I think a lot of people have had bad experiences with reporters, and I know inaccurate things are reported. Sometimes if you hear your own voice on a tape recorder, it doesn't sound like you. So even if the reporter's right, but I know I've made mistakes. I know every reporter does because you're working fast. On the other hand, I think a lot of people also don't like reporters because what they write is accurate. And in my experience of the Exxon Valdez oil spill is that on those big questions I just mentioned, actually the media got them right. Got right, that yes, it was very bad. Got right really whose fault it was. And the fact that the cleanup, because of, as Larry Dietrich said, the first 3 days were bungled, most of the rest of it really wasn't that meaningful for all the billions that were spent. And I don't think any of the players really came off very well, frankly. And if you go back and read the NTSB report, the Coast Guard gets tons of blame. Their vessel traffic system really wasn't functioning. The person there wasn't trained. Exxon certainly gets tons of blame. The state had a contingency plan that was just paper. They should have known that. They had people there who had pointed that out. The science, there were good scientists there. Everybody was trying, but the science effort really was at times very counterproductive for people who needed clear, basic information. And it went on and on and on, and ended up spending $300 million answering questions that really nobody was asking. The legal profession was maybe the most destructive part of the whole thing. People's lives were ruined waiting for those cases to be resolved, and the legal efforts really crippled the science effort. Just sort of the general bureaucracy which surrounded the money that came out of it became a self-perpetuating thing as well. So there's plenty of blame to go around, and I hopefully we learn a lot about it. But my point is that those folks don't necessarily want that story told. So the job of a reporter is always going to be in conflict with the agencies, with the scientists, with the lawyers, with the responders, and that's just the way it works. So if you don't like it, that's what the cost we pay for living in a democratic society, where slowly but surely the society as a whole becomes aware of these problems and addresses them. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And Ron?
Well, as somebody who's dealt with the press for 4 decades, I don't take objection to anything you said. I mean, we have to be able to talk to the American public that we serve in terms that are honest and forthright. Sometimes we forget in the haste of spills and the political pressures and all that kind of stuff, and it's not that it's sometimes done intentionally, just you get overwhelmed and it's hard to focus on it. But as I mentioned earlier today, if you look at the progression of what's happened in our society, when the Exxon Valdez occurred, I think we were just starting to use IBM PCs. There hadn't been a tweet or a Facebook in 2005 for Katrina. Haiti came along, was the first widespread use of Yashidi in crowdsourcing. And of course, we put a web page out for the Deepwater Horizon response, and now if you don't occupy that space and fill it with information, become transparent, you're going to abdicate a credibility position that you can't afford to lose in one of these situations. We were talking at dinner. I consider what's happened in the last 15 years between the internet, what we're doing with bandwidth and mobility, high performance computation, social media, in my view, is a sociological equivalent of climate change. John Holdren has said there are 3 ways to deal with climate change: suffer, adapt, or manage. I would submit to you, when we are looking at the media and the internet and the 24-hour news cycle right now, we have 3 choices: we can suffer, adapt, or manage.
So I am going to be the odd man out and use some photos, I think. I learned while giving talks at my kids' school that it makes sense to have pictures to give people something to look at. If you don't command as much authority as Admiral Allen, or if you have to speak after him. There we go. Okay, so just real briefly, I started covering the oil spill for Nature, the news section of Nature, and very quickly was asked to go hitch a ride on the Pelican for basically the second leg of the first research cruise into the spill zone, and was there for the discovery of the infamous deep plume. Ended up spending more and more time. I wrote for other places, the New York Times, Chemical and Engineering News, variety of publications, and all of that grew into a book project. I wrote a book, and the focus was the science, and the publisher liked it, and then the publisher decided they didn't like it and canceled it at the last minute. But I would never say anything bad about my publisher, because I signed an agreement saying that I would never say anything bad about my publisher. But I bring that up because to give the context of what I'm going to be saying, the wonderful thing about this book project was it gave me the opportunity to really spend a lot of time trying my best to understand a very big story. So my perspective is a little different from daily reporters, because I didn't have to file daily stories. I didn't have to file weekly stories. I was doing a few things along the way, but mostly I was researching this book. So I was able to spend the time that I felt like it would take to really figure some of this out. Of course, I didn't figure it all out, but I did spend a great deal of time offshore, a little bit of time in the air. I spent weeks and weeks wandering around the Gulf with my own boat and staying on it out in some of the areas that were harder to reach. I had a kayak. I had access to everything. When the reporters were having trouble reporting on things, I would just take my boat to the island over, and there was nobody there. It didn't cause any problems. Spent a lot of time on desolate beaches, seeing all of the work in there. This is just the places that I went. I didn't go by boat. I dragged the boat on a trailer. I couldn't afford that much gas. I also had the chance to go to Mexico with a man named Wes Tunnell, who was going down. He had done some work on Ishtok back in the day and was going back wanted to see some remote villages, see what had happened. And I was amazed. It may not be that surprising to you all. Fisherman after fisherman that I interviewed, every single one of them thought that Ishtok was a small spill. The first time the translator said that, I said, wait, back up. What? Small spill? Up until the time I was standing there, it was the largest offshore spill in history, and they thought it was a small spill because the government told them it was a small spill. And back then, you had newspapers that, if any news made it out to these villages, it was by newspaper. The government said it was small. They thought it was small, even though they had the oil. And I raised that point because, although it might sound tempting to some of the people here, I hope we can all agree that's bad. That's really not a good plan. So we've come as much as you can be at the opposite of that, of course, is where we are. Now we have this endless flow of information. So I wanted to find an analogy for the current media landscape. And I was thinking that zombies might be something that people could identify with, maybe some press conferences that looked a little bit along these lines. But instead, I settled on the estuary because this is something I think a lot about myself to try and figure these things out, not just for this talk. And the analogy I wanted to make is that, in an estuary, you're mixing salt water and fresh water. In a way, it's the same now when you have this constant flow of information. So I'm going to call, it's kind of arbitrary, I'm going to call salt water good information, fresh water bad information. And it's a fight between these two things at the inlets. And the best you can do, because there isn't a solution, there's no way, how do we fix these you can't really, fix the current media landscape. I think the best you can do is I think that's kind of what Admiral Allen was referring to, is figure out how to manage and how to adjust. So I wanted to talk, that brings me to the getting at some points. How do you raise salinity? From my perspective, I'm moving through very quickly here. I know that people like all these people that have to work on the other side of the media, I know I don't have the whole story, so I'll just say this is just kind of my perspective. One of the biggest, it's obvious in some ways, but it's such a key factor in working with the media now, is that the voids are going to be filled. That brownish fresh water is going to come fill the space if you don't let the good information flow. And I was thinking that one example is the deep plume. When that first happened, and there's all kinds of reasons people have talked about today, there's reasons why people were reluctant to comment on some of that and everything else. But the fact is, that story was out there, and it should have been perfectly reasonable to take some time to catch breath and figure out how to address this from the government side and everything else. But the void was filled by absolute whack jobs in some cases. There were people talking about it became a lake of oil. There was a lake of oil the size of the state of Washington and 500 feet thick. And if the calculations were done, it takes something like 177 trillion gallons of oil to do that. Completely just insane, but that's ends up being what has to be fought because there was a void. Another one we were talking a lot about at dinner that came into play a lot in the work that I was doing is letting the first-hand experts speak. We need voices of authority. I think we can all agree to that. But also the people that are doing the work, that aren't presenting information second-hand, sometimes third-hand, or whatever it is. And they may have been mistaken at times, but time and again, I tried to work with scientists who did not feel that they were allowed to speak to me, even to talk about things that they had expertise on. And, hopefully I'm not the kind of void that I'm talking about, but it was a problem. And I don't know how many people are here from the EPA, but they're the most notorious example during the spill. They just basically quit agreeing to do any interviews on dispersants. And it wasn't just that they didn't like me. They may not have, but it happened everywhere. There were letters sent to the EPA, and you could not get an interview. And somebody's going to talk about the dispersant. Somebody's going to talk about the dispersant science. It ought to be the people that are doing the studies. I did one article. So I have a chemical oceanography degree. I was writing for Chemical and Engineering News, not exactly a tabloid. I was writing about a study written by an EPA scientist. And I could not get approval for an interview for that. And this was sometime after the spill. So that ties hand in hand with the void, is that you've got to let people speak, or you create these voids. No time for normal review. You could have another day talking about this. People have talked about some of the operational review. There's got to be a system, but it's also got to be very abbreviated if you want to fight the voids and try and raise the salinity in a very difficult situation. Also not... all these things I'm talking about are reasonable. Review, multiple levels of review. A lot of times press release went to the agency and then it had to go to the White House and come back to the agency and everything else. Perfectly reasonable in some sense, but it creates a lot of problems over and over again, and people are going to have to rethink that, and it's going to be even worse with the next disaster. But then, of course, another side of I'm all for speaking and talking as openly as possible and as truthfully as possible, but there is, of course, always an issue if there's overreach. Flow rate was an example, and I know that was a complicated situation, but that number went out, and it was certainly it was an incorrect number, and it started eroding public trust from the start, so that's another danger. And underreach is what I would call what I referred to before with some of the voids, where it's less than ideal situation. You wish it hadn't been a story, but it's a story, and it's going to continue to be, so you have to I would recommend not pulling back so much from that. So I'll stop there. I'm sure I'm close to 5 if I'm not over.
Thanks. That's great. Justin?
Thank you, Dave. Justin Kenny with the Pew Charitable Trust. And as Dave mentioned, I had the privilege of being the Director of Communications under Dr. Lubchenco. from April 2009 to 2012. Tonight I'm speaking, though, not on behalf of Pew or NOAA, but just my own thoughts. So I was going to just offer 5 reflections, since you had to drag all these memories back up that I had suppressed over the last 4.5 years. 5 reflections on from where I sat in terms of the role of communications in the media. First one certainly is be prepared and go big early. Just by chance, I had a couple of briefings with Dave Westerholm and others right before this thing happened. And I even remember saying to them, look, I know this isn't going to happen on my watch, but if it did, how does this work? And it was very helpful just to get that couple of briefings under our belt 2 months later when this happened. And then because of that, within days of the event and the JIC being set up, I had members of my team go down. I didn't even wait to be asked to be invited. I said, just go, show up, take your NOAA hat off, go inside and say you're here to work. And from that point on, we had people at the JIC the entire time, throughout the Gulf the entire time, and basically running around my office the entire time. So that's the first one. The second one, numbers matter, and that includes uncertainty. It's been mentioned several times. We got hammered on flow rate, on oil budget. I would urge us now, in a period of calm, to kind of agree what are the big numbers around a spill, who owns them, what are the uncertainties around them, and how do we talk about them so that we don't get tripped up this way again, because it does erode confidence, it does erode morale. Get those numbers right, agree on the terms of reference and all that kind of stuff with the press, with the government, with the industry, and see if we can't work that out ahead of time. Number 3, I think it's time to rethink the JIC. And by that, I don't mean to get rid of it by any means. It's an extremely important part of the response. But in this day and age, and I'm going to assume this is already happening anyway, so apologies if I'm a little out of touch here.
Justin, would you identify what the JIC is?
The Joint Information Center,
Yeah.
excuse me. As a way where information can flow in and out, I think it still has a very valuable role. But obviously, in this day and age, it needs to be modernized and rethink how it works anymore. Government agencies are as much a media outlet in terms of what the stories are putting out as are advocacy groups, business groups, let alone the mainstream media. But I think it's time to rethink the role of the JIC. And I would include in that the role that the responsible party plays standing side by side with the government in these spills. I just think that's, I think time has passed, that relationship. Number 4, principles matter, and they especially matter in a crisis. Working under Dr. Lubchenco, we had several principles that we tried to adhere to in our communications. The importance of scientific integrity, tell people what you know and tell them what you don't know. The importance of transparency. I know it's a quaint idea, but I thought that my role as a public servant was this information is the public's, and it was our responsibility to get it to them as quickly as we could, as transparently as could, and another principle as clearly as we could, to meet people where they are and not hide behind jargon and acronyms, but to speak clearly. How do you do that? The challenge here then is, how do you do that in a crisis? Well, the answer has to be, you have to. If you let a crisis erode your principles, you're doomed. And you start to lose confidence and you start to lose public trust. So you've got to maintain those principles in a crisis. It's hard to do, but it can be done and has to be done. And then finally, and actually I thought Bethany did a great job of this today, I think it's important to remember that these are as much human tragedies as they are environmental disasters. I think this is something that we could have done a lot better on the government side, speaking for myself, and especially early on. I'm sure we all have anecdotes like this. I remember talking to a charter boat captain in New Orleans, and he had a legal pad with him, and on it was his handwriting of all names and phone numbers, long list. And each one of them was crossed out. And I asked him what that was, and he said, that was my list of customers that I had for the next couple of months, and they've all canceled. So his business is gone for the year. So there are thousands of stories like that, and they're important stories. I think our communications could have reflected people's fears and anger better. I think they could have been more sympathetic and responsive to that, as well as being factually correct. So finding that balance between that and, again, kind of meeting people where they are in terms of communications. So that's a few of my perspectives, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Ann?
Hi, I'm Ann Thompson. I am the Chief Environmental Affairs Correspondent for NBC News, and for 5 months in the year 2010, I was a resident of Venice, Louisiana. I spent my first month on a houseboat until BP and the government came in and offered the houseboat owner a better deal. And then I moved to a fish camp for the next 4 months. We actually had 3 of them. I was in what we called girl condo, and then there was boy condo 1 and boy condo 2. But we decided to base ourselves in Venice because that's where the story was happening. It wasn't happening in New Orleans. But Venice was the closest point, the furthest point south in Louisiana, and the closest point you could get to where the oil was coming ashore. And even then, it was still a 45-minute boat ride out to the Gulf of Mexico, and then another 2 hours out to the Macondo well. So it was a very arduous story to cover. And what happened when I got down there, because I actually went there to do a story about what if there was an oil spill, because you'll remember after the Deepwater Horizon blew, there was no oil spill, or that's what we were told. And we went down there on the Friday after the Deepwater Horizon blew up, and we were calling around marinas, and people were incredulous. There's no oil spill. We lived with the oil industry for 40 years down here. Nothing's going to be wrong. And in fact, a week later, one of those marina owners called us back to apologize for being so incensed that we were even asking that question at that point. But one of the things I had done about a year earlier, I was pitching, I wanted to go to Alaska to do the 20th anniversary of the Exxon Valdez spill. And I had done all this research, and my bosses ended up not buying the story because it was too expensive to send us up there. But one of the things I realized in the research that I did for the Exxon Valdez is that when there's an oil spill, the answers don't come quickly, that it takes years, and in some cases decades, to understand the environmental impact of a disaster. And I would suggest that we are far from understanding the complete picture, the complete impact that the Deepwater Horizon oil spill has had on the Gulf of Mexico. There are 2 things that I do know for certain, though, that there are 2 great casualties of the Deepwater Horizon. One are the 11 men who died on that rig, and their names are Jason Anderson, Dale Burking, Donald Clark, Stephen Curtis, Gordon Jones, Wyatt Kemp, Carl Kleppinger, Blair Manuel, Dewey Rivette, Shane Rostow, and Adam Wise. Those are 11 souls that are lost, 11 families that live in pain every day because of what happened there. And the second big casualty I would suggest is trust. And that goes back to the oil flow rate that you talked about earlier today. As I said, when I got down there, we were told there was no oil spill. Then on that Saturday night, we were told there was an oil spill. We were told there were 1,000 barrels a day coming out, and then 5,000 barrels a day. And then BP said it really didn't matter how many barrels a day were coming out of the well because they were throwing everything they had at the problem. Well, that just simply defied logic, because you can't solve a problem unless you know how big that problem is. And by refusing to answer that basic question of how many barrels of oil were coming out of that well every day, it really eroded the public's trust. BP had a really good reason not to answer that question, because depending on how many barrels spilled would depend on the size of the fines that they will pay under the Clean Water Act. But it really hurt them. And I saw that in my charter boat captain. We had the fastest boat in Venice, and it was captained by a guy named James Peters. And he used to take people out for tuna trips, and attorneys and executives and all kinds of folks. And then once the oil spill happened, he took us out for 5 months. And in August, about a month after the well had been plugged, we're out on Barataria Bay, and Captain James just absolutely lost it. He just couldn't believe that BP would have done this to the water and the land that he loved so much. And he started spouting these conspiracy theories that BP and the government were in cahoots, and that at that time NBC was owned by General Electric, and that somehow General Electric was in cahoots with BP and the government, and they were controlling me. And I'm thinking, I eat dinner with you every night. You know, I'm out on a boat with you 8 hours a day. You know nobody's controlling me. But that's how tapped out he was. That's how frustrated he was. And today I called him when I was on my way up here, and I said, how's business? And he's had a great October. They've done a lot of tuna fishing, but they're all noticing that the speckled trout, they're having the worst year for speckled trout down there that they've had, he said, in 30 or 40 years. And the first thing everybody thinks about anytime they see something different in the fish is the oil spill. So again, this story, the well may have been plugged, but the story is far from over.
Thanks, Ann. Sean?
Thank you. Good evening. In March 2011, The New Yorker published an article called The Gulf War. Were there any heroes in the BP oil spill response? And one of the quotes that resonated with me was they interviewed a Coast Guard lieutenant commander at the end of one day of response. And he wrote, "It felt like a battle, because if you watched the news, you were losing. But in the response, you were doing pretty much everything that could possibly be done." And that, I think, summed up the response and the sentiment of many Coast Guard members who were down there doing their best possible work. This was an alien feeling for most of our service. The Coast Guard is an armed service. It's a federal law enforcement agency. It's an emergency response organization. The nature of our work is inherently dangerous, but somewhat routine because we're used to doing it and we're used to a good battle rhythm in communicating with the media, with our elected officials, and with the public. But this experience at Deepwater Horizon was something entirely different. In April 2011, 1 month later, Juliette Kayyem, who had been an assistant secretary in DHS during the oil spill, wrote an op-ed in the Boston Globe, and she summed it up with, "In hindsight, it's clear to me that there were two different responses to the spill, one political, one operational. Despite some fits and starts, the operational response largely worked. But it was the political response that garnered so much attention and seemed so disconnected from what was going on day to day operationally." And so I use that to create a context that this was a foreign experience for so many Coast Guard men and women. And so as we get ready, we have to understand what happened to us during Deepwater as we plan for the next one, which we hope won't happen, but realistically may. The theme for my brief remarks is simply this: if you want a new idea, read an old book. And so the books I looked at before tonight's panel were from one of my favorite American authors, the U.S. Coast Guard. Thank you. At the end of every major oil spill incident or response, the Coast Guard triggers its own internal report with an independent panel staffed by federal subject matter experts, state subject matter experts, locals, non-governmental organizations, as well as members from the industry. It's called an ISPR, or an Incident-Specific Preparedness Review or report. And they look carefully at what happened and they come up with lessons learned. The Deepwater Horizon ISPR was triggered in June 2010 while the spill was ongoing, and shortly afterwards they were able to publish it early in 2011. Two themes came out pretty clear. One is that we need to spend more time helping our senior officers, our flag officers, prepare to be in front of the media and engage the public more frequently than we're currently investing in them now. The second is that we need to spend more time and resources training up our operational first responders to be able to interact with the media on a more timely basis and give them the information they need. Some of the anecdotes they observed include, quote, "The trained and qualified public affairs specialists deployed were quickly overwhelmed by the tremendous demand for information, inefficient communications, as well as external political influence on response organizations." Looking deeper, they said, quote, "Flag officers and operational commanders received minimal public affairs training disproportionate to the amount of time they could potentially spend conducting media interviews, press briefings, or other public relations activities during their tours of duty. In recent years, several incidents involving the Coast Guard as a lead agency have received national media attention, including Hurricane Katrina, the Potomac River security exercise, and the Haiti earthquake of 2010. In all these situations, the Coast Guard has required public affairs expertise among those in command positions to effectively communicate the Coast Guard's role in the response effort. So as we get ready for the next major incident of a scope and scale of Deepwater Horizon, we're wise to look at this and see if we can make changes based on it. But this wasn't a one-time lesson learned for our service. If we go back to the ISPR written in 2007 from the 58,000-gallon oil spill in San Francisco Bay by the Costco Busan, some of the same lessons keep recurring. In fact, of the 190 recommendations, 10 or 12 focus specifically on external affairs and public relations, and it's right there. And if you go back to San Francisco Bay into 1996, with a motor vessel SS Cape Mohican, which spilled 40,000 gallons into San Francisco Bay, those same lessons that were reiterated during the Costco Busan ISPR and then again in Deepwater Horizon are there. So it's definitely something we need to focus on as an organization and perhaps as a community of responders in taking time to study what has taken place so that we can prepare for the next one on the communication side. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Before I get into the questions, I'm afraid maybe we lulled people into complacency about not asking questions. I only have 2 on my screen, and our card carriers, oh, they're coming around right now. I want to get our card carriers out and try and generate a couple, 3 questions here, if we can. I'll get into ours. I guess the first thing I would ask of the panel is, from everything you heard, are there any comments or questions on the individuals that spoke? Anything anybody wanted to comment or say? Okay. I think I'm going to start with one that question, not the first one here on our list. I think we've kind of covered it, but one that has at least partially been covered, but I want to give the panel an opportunity just to see if there's anything else here. And it's, what are the major challenges in covering a spill from government and media perspectives? Does anybody want to pick that up and talk some more about it? We've covered it some, but Charles?
Well, I can talk from the media perspective and from the obsolete perspective of 25 years ago. I think it's changed a lot. You know, the Exxon Valdez spill was, you know, and the next spill may be in the Arctic, so it may be very similar. Getting to the spill is incredibly difficult. I think that was true in the Gulf too, but I mean, it's on a scale that's really hard to imagine. You know, it took, to get from one end of the spill to the other, took an all day, a day of travel. You had to change planes to get from one end of the spill to the other and then get in a helicopter. And so you effectively, you know, an entire day to get from one side of the event to the other side of the event. You know, Exxon chartered all the vessels and all the airplanes. Probably Noah chartered the rest. So you couldn't get out there. And my newspaper ended up buying a boat for me to drive around. I spent the summer driving a Boston whaler around Prince William Sound and camping out to get the story. So, the other thing is local knowledge. And I think this is always, in every spill, this is going to be a huge issue. I'd been boating out there my whole life, and I knew how to drive a boat, and so I had a big advantage. But most reporters would come in and not even know the geography, right? Not know where things were and where people were and what these beaches were like. And so that's a huge challenge, which makes it very easy to make mistakes and to be sort of led by the nose in the wrong direction. And then finally, the local reporters don't know how to cover an oil spill because they've never seen one before. And certainly that was my case. And so you have to make yourself an expert very, very rapidly. And I know I made mistakes that way. I feel like I did learn a lot quickly, thanks to you and other people, and Jackie educated me quite a bit. But that's tough. But though that is also a double-edged sword, because I remember being on when the oil first arrived on the beach on Naked Island and seeing it. having never seen that before, it probably had more an effect than if I had seen it before. I suppose maybe nobody had, but so I think those issues of remoteness and also of communication. This is not an issue anymore, but we were filing stories by two-way radio. Now, I think a lot of these issues would be different because you'd have an instantaneous communication with everywhere you want to get information from.
Thanks. Ron?
Yeah, we had talked about this earlier at dinner. I believe, and this is consistent with my earlier comment about sociological equivalent of climate change. I think the world that the citizens of the United States live in right now creates a rebuttable presumption of the art of the possible. When you look at what we carry in our wallets, our wallets are smart credit cards, phones, internet, and so forth. Government does not evolve as fast as technology. And I think with the ubiquity of information, the ability to put out images of people that are suffering, what's happening at a local level, creates a demand signal from our citizens that there ought to be something the government is doing about this, and this far exceeds what is usually in the authorizing language and the appropriations restrictions on government agency. And I think what we're dealing with here is a need for government to evolve and address what is a growing, in my view, kind of a mismatch in the social contract about what constitutes a whole of government response, whole community, whole of nation response, whatever you might want to call it. And I think it's going to be incumbent on leaders in government, if they're going to handle these large, complex situations to the satisfaction of the American people, that we start to address the various parameters of these responses in the terms and under the conditions that they're being experienced by the citizens that are evaluating our performance.
Justin, and then...
So a couple challenges from the NOAA perspective. Certainly, one right off the bat was that in this instance, we're not fully in charge, and that was difficult. I have nothing but incredible respect for the Coast Guard and the government that response on this, and that only grew in working closely with them and others. But it is different when you're suddenly part of a unified command, and you're basically working in what is in essence a crime scene. The rules are different, and there are realities that come with that. That was a major challenge. The other one is just we are completely outmanned. I had a staff of about 30 people, and NOAA's responsibilities here. We're the science advisors. We're responsible for tracking the oil, the damage assessment, seafood safety, marine mammals and turtles, doing the spot weather forecasts. And it was all hands on deck, and anybody who walked by my office, I'd grab them and pull them in and put them to work. But even still, it was extreme. Many nights when you go home and you just wonder if you're up for the task. I mean, it's a lot. And that's only going to get worse next time. So we've got to start thinking about how we're going to staff this. Should this happen again at this scale, it's going to be very, very difficult.
Ann, and then Mark, okay, Ann, and then Mark.
I think one of the challenges was just how do you drill for oil in deep water? I didn't know much about it before the explosion happened. And I think one of the good things that BP did is that it created a conference call that happened 5 or 6 times a week with Kent Wells, who is the Senior Vice President of Engineering, who very patiently for 3 months explained to reporters, most of whom were like me and knew very little about how to drill for oil in deep water, explained what they were doing and talked us through containment domes and top hats. And yes, we got to say the word annulus on national TV, which frightened the living daylights out of me. But it was fascinating. He was extraordinarily patient, and it made a huge difference because it gave us somebody who was working on the project who could tell us what was going on rather than going to a third party about how it was done. And that is one thing I think that BP did very well through that disaster. Providing Kent Wells was I think, a very smart thing to do.
Mark?
Yeah, I was just going to say that from the bigger picture challenge that affects both sides, the media and those of you trying to get the information out is, I mean, obviously we all know that the media has changed incredibly, but it might have been the tail end of it, but with Valdez was still a day when people had basically the same starting point. Was Cronkite still reporting in then we didn't mean everybody agreed with him. Certainly people had their problems with it, but everybody started there, and then you decided how much you didn't agree, and you worked from that point. And now there is no universal starting point. There's nothing even approaching a universal starting point. So you have all these different starting places. You have all of these different ways of getting information, obviously much of it skewed in various ways. And so it's a real challenge for the media to rise above that noise, and for those who want to get information out, to rise above the noise, and also to reach anything like a broad audience, because you can't do it through one mechanism or one route anymore.
Okay. Anyone else? Good? Okay, I have two more generic questions, and I asked, and you've responded. The questions are rolling in here, so, and like Marcia, some of them are pretty good. So we'll get to those in a second here. So the last two I'm going to kind of just lump together. But how has oil spill communications evolve to match the changing media landscape? And the last one that we had here was social media, game changer. You've touched on this a little bit, folks, but another opportunity to elaborate on that a little bit, because I think there's a lot more we could talk about there. Admiral Allen?
I do a lot of talking about social media and crisis management, and I start with the movie, The King's Speech. Everybody see it? Mm-hmm. Great movie, right? I love that movie. So I start with a little bit of a quiz about who was the protagonist. Was it the speech teacher? Was it his wife who wanted to talk better? Was it his brother who left him with a divorcee and went to America? Who's the protagonist? It was the radio. Roosevelt's giving fireside chats. Hitler's talking to 200,000 people in Nuremberg. They're being broadcast around Europe. He had no choice. We have no choice.
Okay, that about wraps that up. How about anybody else?
Well,
Any other thoughts?
it's obviously critical. I was trying to remember, Justin and I actually had a conversation about this a couple years ago. I was trying to think of, wasn't trying to think of naive ways, but I was effectively thinking of naive ways, and I'm not sure whether any solutions came out. I was thinking you have these voices that, the zero barrier. You have some voices that catch on. I can't remember the name. There was a woman that talked a lot about health issues that was from down Venice. But I was wondering if, should somebody from an agency or something try to seek out these people and, just offer to really work through things with them. And of course, he pointed out that they would think that was just shy of coming to take their guns. I
remember this conversation we had.
Oh, you were...
Was I there?
Oh, yes. You said really good things. But anyway, so it's critical, but difficult.
Okay. Charles and then Justin.
Well, I think, there's the obvious side, which is that there's this massive amount of false and information and stuff that you have to fight and figure out what's right and what's not right. On the other hand, though, I think that there's also a sort of a fact-checking mechanism that takes place. In the Exxon Valdez, we had this problem that the oil spill was out there. It was very difficult to get to, and the media was in Valdez. And so it was really possible to do spin where information which was not true was given to the media and reported. And
Are you reading my questions over here?
no, I'm not, but I remember it really well. And I heard it described, it was sort of like, I was certainly too young for Vietnam, but I read about the reporting experience there. In Saigon, there are these press briefings that are taking place, and then the good reporters going into the field and finding out what's really happening, and the two don't necessarily match up, or even if the information in Saigon is nominally accurate, it doesn't reflect the real picture of what's happening. And that was very, very true. With Exxon Valdez, and now I think you'd have 10,000 workers out there with phones, and there'd be no way you could do that anymore. And that's a really big change. So I don't think you can fake it anymore. And that for what it's worth, that's good. Now you still have to sift through all that junk that's coming in and find out what's made up and what's real. and that's a different aspect. But I don't do beat reporting or breaking news anymore, but you know, it makes it a lot easier in a lot of ways. It's easier to find people. It's easier to sort of communicate with a lot of people at once. You have to do more sifting, but you can sort of get more information a lot faster from a lot of different places.
Okay. Justin?
So NOAA is just getting into social media while I was there, and I look back and boy, I wish I was on Twitter during the oil spill. I think it could have been. So social media is absolutely a game changer, and I'm assuming the government agencies are already thinking about this. You know, we were talking about the difficulty, for example, of reaching experts, turtle experts, for example, and the people who are on the field. They could be tweeting all day long out there. You're going to basically turn these experts into reachable sources throughout the day. I could imagine we'd set up a Twitter feed for seafood safety, for turtles, for dolphins, for whales, whatever, and you'd be able to follow this. Now, granted, this is an extreme event, this spill, and an event like this going on for as long as it did, but if we're not planning for how to communicate an event like this in an age of social media, when you've got tens of thousands of reporters out there, basically, and witnesses out there commenting all day long, we need to be.
Okay. Sean, and then I'll back to Admiral.
I just wanted to share one insight that actually Steve Lehman from NOAA provided. Is Steve still here? Then it's mine. It was my idea.
I think I was on that conversation, wasn't I with you?
I think you were there too, Justin. Steve was saying, and I agree, it's not just critical that the responders get out there on social media themselves and blog and tweet and communicate, but they also find who the opinion leaders are in the social media realm and go to them and be available as a subject matter expert and recognize there's an entire audience that are looking at this medium only and perhaps not as much with traditional media as we're used to.
Okay. Admiral.
I was really proud of myself when I was a commandant because I put a Google alert out on myself. And I would get an email every time something hit Google, and I thought I was really out on the edge of things. Of course, it was a while back. I'm trying to give a more detailed answer this time. There's an app that I use right now called Net Vibes that allows you to establish a dashboard for a topic or a term or whatever, and it goes to 10 sources, and it comes up like a dashboard, and it's Twitter. It's, it's the blogs, it's Google, it's everything. Every major thing that I'm involved in my business or I get involved in professionally, I have a dashboard. And I look at them every day, and it's not just a Google word alert. It's everything that's out there on these, and you can customize the dashboards. That's the access to information that people have out there, and we've got to understand that.
Okay. That all on that one? So, the questions are rolling in, and I'm going to try and combine some of them because there's a couple of themes here, some specific questions, but a couple of themes that maybe I'll start with this one, but add two or three to it. What are the most important elements associated with being considered credible to the media? There is another one here that talks about fact-checking. How is it that you try and assure that you have a story that's accurate and appropriate? There's one here on when and if you get a story wrong, not that any of you probably ever have, but should you have ever gotten a story wrong, how do you go about trying to correct that? Is there a process for trying to correct it? And then there's another kind of related one about some folks that are concerned about, they feel like the press has the ultimate end say and power in an interview. In other words, if you're encouraged to give an interview, how is it you're going to know that what is said there actually represents what you said in your interview? With then a few paragraphs explaining how they felt like they got screwed in interviews that they've done in the past. And I can appreciate that myself. It's happened to me where
Yeah, you're not
I
allowed read to submit questions, Dave.
What's that?
You're not allowed to submit questions.
Oh. Well, there's quite a theme there, and I think some good thought for you guys to come back. So Who wants to start that one? You're kind of up, leaning forward. Why don't-
start?
Yeah.
Well, because it's almost easier for what I do because more often than not, what I'm covering is science. So credibility in science, not to say that there's not disreputable scientists out there who have published good papers or whatever, but there's a pretty, to check credibility, I look at people's records. I talk to other people in the field and those kinds of things. So it's more or less clear cut for me. Let's see, correcting, if I were to have ever gotten anything wrong ever. If somebody comes to me and there's a real factual issue with something that I've reported, I can go and get that corrected. Nowadays, it's a blessing and a curse. Online, things stay there forever and everything else. More often than not, people will have read it and will never go back and see the correction there, but you can at least correct that record, and I would go immediately to an editor to talk about that. However, I should make the distinction here, and I'd be interested to read your paragraphs. Oftentimes, people will come to me, sometimes even threatening lawsuits with what they say are factual errors, and then you walk through with them, and they're not, in fact, pointing out any factual errors, not to say at all that we don't make factual errors, but often they're not pointing out factual errors, they're pointing out what they view as perspective errors. So they don't think I should have written the story about blank, or they don't think that this should have been reported or whatever. They're not actual factual errors. So it's an important distinction to make. You can dislike what I write very much, and it can still be factually accurate. So gosh, there was a whole long list there. I don't know, I've certainly never felt like I had ultimate power in an interview or anywhere else. But I guess what you'd have to say, or the first thing that came to mind is that if you're working with a professional, I mean, there's lots of places where we have to trust professionals to do their jobs well. I don't know, I can't think of a good analogy, but if you go to the doctor, you trust them. I know it's very different, but you trust them not to laugh at you when they put you under and send pictures around or whatever. Reporters certainly make mistakes, but professional reporters, you can have that expectation that you're going to be presented, the things that you say are going to be presented accurately. So I guess then it comes down to who you work with and some thought about outlets and those kinds of things. I don't know, was that the whole list?
Yep. Well, that's a good
Much
start.
of it.
But Charles is anxious to get in here, so go right
Well,
ahead.
I just wanted just some practical advice. I've been on both sides. I was on the assembly in Anchorage for 6 years and was subject to some unfair reporters that went after me. And I think that a couple of things you can do. One is sort of know who you're talking to. You don't have to do an interview. Another is if you get the feeling that the person has a preconceived notion, you can end the interview. You don't have to keep talking to them. And the other thing is, everyone who has a smartphone now has a tape recorder. And if you go into an important meeting, you take somebody with you, right? Well, you do that going into an interview, or you just turn on the recorder and put it on the table, and that will intimidate most reporters and cause them to be very careful with how they talk to you, So in terms of, the other thing is that what's the medium that you're being written about in? When I write books, I take the material and I give it back to the source, and I let them review it and tell me what they think. A lot of newspapers and outlets consider that to be unethical because they think it opens them up to some kind of prior restraint. The person could sort of sue and say you can't publish that, but I've actually never had that happen. And I tell the people, I want to hear your opinion. If you have inaccurate information, I'll fix it. If you disagree with what I'm saying, I'll discuss it with you. And so I don't end up with inaccuracies in my books. If I'm doing a daily newspaper story or if I'm doing a blog, then it's going to be faster and it's going to be more on the fly, and you just have to do your best. And it feels like, for the most part, we get it right, but I feel like, and I don't want to sound like an old curmudgeon, is that reporters today kind of have a thing like they can't wait for the next day's newspaper. It's got to go out right now. And so there's a lot more sort of one-source stories and stories that are just very poorly reported, and bad information sort of works its way out that way and then gets reported, and many blogs don't do their own reporting. They'll pick up the bad information and bounce it back and forth. And I'm not sure exactly what to do about that, but it's a really unfortunate trend in our industry.
Thanks. Justin, were you wanting to be up? Anyone down there? Okay. Well, thank you for those answers. Here's one that actually has been sitting here since before we even started, and so I feel obligated to do this one. And it reads, how do we get the word out to the public that there are spill professionals who train for response, the same as doctors, lawyers, firefighters, etc.? The public seems to have the impression that each spill is a first and no lessons have been learned from previous responses and no research on the subject takes place. So there's a little bit of a statement there, but I think many of us can relate to that. So are there any thoughts on that? You all agree?
No, I would disagree. I think I mean, I can remember when I was down in Louisiana talking to people who had worked on Valdez. I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think one of the things that happened is it was just the length of time between Valdez and Deepwater Horizon and how much things had changed from a technological standpoint. And I know that one of the great frustrations we had was just when you would go out into the marshes and you're watching these guys in hazmat suits using, what looked like giant cleaning cloths to stop the oil that was coming into the marsh. It's sort of, you've got a 21st or 20th century problem and you're using, 15th century technology, it seemed in some cases. But one of the things we were always after is, what's the next step? How do we do this better? And I think that technology, I think there was a lot of curiosity about that, but I think there's no question that the public was frustrated, the media was frustrated, I'm sure Admiral Allen was frustrated, that we couldn't find, there wasn't a easier, better way to stop this than drilling the relief well that was going to take 3 months. And I don't know. I don't think that everybody thinks that, we start from scratch every time. It's just that these two spills were very different.
Okay.
I would add, you need to talk to your communications team. In terms of getting these stories out, they are great stories, and there are lots of ways to get them out, of course, on social media, on your own websites, and regional, local press, and so on. But this was something I thought was we didn't seize this opportunity during the spill, and that was a chance to tell more of these stories. I saw thousands of people all across government doing really cool things, important jobs out there. And I know I tried to make a point that I didn't want to have no a ship, no a boat, no a plane, no a team leave if there was a seat open on it. If there was a seat open on it, let's put a reporter on it. Again, that wasn't always possible, but that was the goal. Let's show people what we're doing. These are people who live in your hometowns, who come from your home states, who went to your colleges. I mean, whatever. There's lots of connections there that people can have with the folks who are doing these jobs, and I thought we could have done a lot more of that. There was a lot of good stuff that was done, but I think you could do more.
Just a couple of comments. First of all, and I'm sure the blue suiters in the room have had this conversation, the worst time to do oil R&D is during an oil spill. There was a tremendous shortening of the half-life of the R&D money that was allocated to oil spill response after the Exxon Valdez. I think guys are in the room around maybe 2 or 3 years, all of a sudden it just fell off the table. We just stopped worrying about it when it got further back. The second thing is when you get something this large and complex, incident command and the things we do have trouble scaling. In this case, we had geographical scale. There were 5 states simultaneously threatened. There wasn't enough boom in the entire world to protect all the shorelines. There was complexity in that the governor of Alabama valued beaches as much as somebody else valued marshland. And we have a higher priority saying you protect the marshland because you mechanically remove oil from beaches. Well, that was an economic tragedy for the state of Alabama. So things weren't working because of scale. And I would say also in incident response, from the command structure itself, and we had talked about this earlier today, ICS did not scale up well, and we kind of jammed it into capping the port boundaries in Mobile and New Orleans. On the other hand, it didn't scale down well either. Where Ann was at down in Venice, if there's oil there ought to be something the local Coast Guard people could, or the federal on-scene coordinator, whoever it is, can do something about it right then under their own autonomy. And we were sometimes captured by the doctrine of ICS, having to request resources and get involved where the doctrine was driving us rather than the right thing to do. So I would think, and this came out in some of the lessons learned and some of the testimony afterwards, we really need to understand when we have an incident we're commanding and when it's something more than an incident, and where maybe there's a new organizing principle we need to take a look at on how we actually do this and delegating authority out to the end so they can make decisions more quickly. I think those are the kind of things we need to look at moving forward as far as incident command.
Charles?
I just wanted to add something to this from the Exxon Valdez perspective, which was, I wrote a lot about this spill cleanup and what Exxon was doing in terms of as a managerial task, as a logistical task, technical task, unbelievable. In a matter of weeks, they built these hotels and put them on barges and put them in the wilderness for 10,000 people. They built hospitals. They built helipads, floating helipads, and you'd go into this remote bay where maybe one person in a year would ever go, and here are like thousands and thousands of people working, eating steak for dinner. You'd go into the dining hall, and it's just like a restaurant, and there's pies turning around in a metal, in a glass thing. Like, what the, I've been out here on a kayak, but I've never thought I'd see that. So that was amazing. But unfortunately, what they're trying to do is impossible, right? They're trying to get oil out of cold rocks, sticky, heavy crude oil out buried from underneath cold rocks without hurting the environment and doing it. Well, you just can't do that. It doesn't work. But no one could acknowledge that. So the big fiction that we had was, we throw enough money at this, we work hard at this, we're going to fix the problem we caused. And that's sort of the story that had to be told. And they threw a ton of money, a ton of technology. They kept inventing things that didn't exist. These hot, they had these barges that would shoot, super hot water at fire pressure, fire hose pressure onto rocks, and amazing stuff. But it didn't work because it's not possible. You can't, once you spill it, once it hits the beaches, you can't clean it up. You can destroy the beach, you can kill everything there, you can make the damage last longer, but you really can't put it back the way it was. That wasn't the story they needed told. They were being pushed by the government to do it. So, yeah, the story comes out that makes them sound like they don't know what they're doing and they're incompetent and it's improvisational. The basic problem is you can't spill, you don't spill the oil. If you can't afford to have the place be destroyed, don't ship oil there, don't develop oil there. Oil is going to spill. If you can't afford to have oil spilled there and not be able to clean up, don't do it.
Okay. I have a specific one for Deepwater, but an interesting one, I think. Should the subsea oil flow camera feed have been broadcast immediately, would that have helped restore the mistrust from the low initial flow estimates?
I think
Well, and you might have a thought on that.
Yeah, I think the answer is probably yes, but again, no answer is simple. In the first, I would say 72, 96 hours after it, and Mary's out in the audience here, she can correct me later if I don't get it right. There was such amount of turbidity in and around the riser pipe that was down there that just trying to get visibility with the ROVs was a problem. Now, after that threshold was passed, there was a legitimate argument to be made to have the video there, but there were certain segments of this response where the real visibility that showed the total impact, in my view, was after the riser pipe was cut. There wasn't an automatic feed at that time, as I remember, and that caused some discussions at the highest levels inside BP. I was always of the opinion that no matter how bad that looked, the notion that somehow the American public wasn't being shown something was an irrefutable, indictment of our credibility. This better story that frames this, though, is a story I had with BP leaders before we put the capping stack on. And we had a long conversation, and they did not want that to be televised because they thought they were going to put the ROV operators under too much stress. And they said, Drew Brees is used to throwing a pass in front of, 50 million people on television. These guys are sitting in a closet on an offshore supply vessel, and it's all being ported back to to the hive in Houston, the high intensity video environment. And they were really concerned that because you have 3 different ROVs just to turn a screw, put the light on, and everything else is very, very complicated. And my position was, understand that, can't do it. This has got to be shown to the American public. It would be a step back. We would regress, and frankly, if something went wrong during the capping stack installation, there would be no way in the world we could ever explain to the American public that this was the reason. And in my view, it wasn't as consequential as showing the oil escaping from the well after the riser pipe had been cut, but a much more consequential one in terms of leadership understanding what their responsibility was to the American public.
Anybody else on that one?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. The JIC and public information officers were mentioned in most of your presentations. I have 2 or 3 more or less related questions. One, given the many layers between the boots on the ground and the NIC level officials approving or providing messages, how can the government be more nimble and thus faster providing information? So we've talked about that, where some of the media here says they really need to talk to the people that are doing the real work. So there's that one. There's one, the Public Information Office and the JIC are typically understaffed for most spill exercises and responses to handle traditional and social media. Public Information Officer is not a significant career track in most response agencies. Do we need to fix this? And then the third one I'll just throw in there, and then you guys can cherry pick this, is Justin, you were talking about the JIC maybe needing to be fixed. Questions here about, well, what's your thinking on that? What needs to be fixed and how? So there's a mouthful there, but plenty to respond to, I think. Who wants to take the first shot at that? Sean.
I'll start off by saying anytime you have more than one organization trying to agree on a message, it's going to get complicated. As recently as this past summer, we had a very minor oil spill in a graving dock in Boston, and our third-class petty officer, public affairs specialist, had the press release out within an hour. It was accurate. It had all the details. The media was happy. There was no concern. As the complexity of trying to recover the oil inside of a dock that's constantly flooding became apparent, we had to work a lot closer with the responsible party. There were 3, and it wasn't clear which one was actually responsible, and their lawyers were not interested in agreeing on that at that point in time. NOAA was there, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was represented as well. And trying to get concurrent clearance on the exact same press release that our third-class petty officer had put out 72 hours before with one minor update was impossible. We just couldn't get it out. No one was willing to sign off on it. And it was a standard spill for the Coast Guard. There was no bad guy involved. There was no impact directly to the environment. It was inside of a contained area. But it just underscores the complexity with different organizations trying to agree on one message. So I don't know if there's one quick panacea to improving the efficacy of the JIC without doing something major that maybe Justin alluded to.
You're going to take the next one, Justin?
Sure. So I look at it again. I have tremendous respect for what it takes to pull something like that off. I guess when I think about modernizing the JIC, I think in terms of what we're even trying to do at NOAA, in terms of being much more the storytellers. That relationship where you put out a press release and reporters call you up and you write a story, and yeah, that still happens sometimes, but really not. You have to be generating and producing your own content so often. And to see the JIC evolve into doing more of that and being a place that is not just responding to the queries that come in, that's important, but also the place that can be producing the credible graphic information that needs to happen for the stories to be told, the maps, the charts, the animations, the videos, all that kind of stuff that goes into the storytelling now. I would think a JIC would have to have its own social media team. I guess we kind of did, but it's going to have built out a social media team, its own graphic design team, content producers, its own blog. It had a great website this past time. I'm sure we'll have to next time greatly increase that level. So that's what I'm thinking of in terms of kind of modernizing, or shouldn't keep saying modernizing, that's not fair.
Yeah, we have to
But-
follow the technology.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Well, in terms of how are you going to get government to move more quickly and stop putting, and clearing press releases and all that kind of stuff, that camera's on. Oh, well. Stop doing them is one way you can get around that. Is to start putting out the content directly to the public. There's lots of other ways to be putting out content.
Yeah, I don't want to get preachy here, but there's a leadership aspect to this. There's no way in the world any political leader can pre-clear a statement you answer contemporaneously on live television. That carries an up and a down.
Yep.
But if you get out there and you get asked the question, in the Coast Guard, there was always a rule. If you know about it, you can talk about it. If you're a third-class petty officer, you just did a rescue, talk all you want. If they ask you about the budget, not your area to discuss. I think there's an element there of,
Yep.
the times that I got crosswise during the hurricane and during the oil spill was when there was this intersection of political interest and what I was supposed to say or what I wasn't supposed to say. And those are the times that I came closest to walking. And sometimes you just got to say, we're going to have this discussion. I've got to have credibility as a leader. I've got to be able to talk.
I was just going to, this is one of those things that, just looking at it from my perspective, and there may be reasons why this doesn't work, but going back to the empowering, allowing more people to speak, I would assume that the reason that kind of thing is restricted mostly is because we want to get messages straight, we want to get things through all these levels of review, and I think it's just a matter of recognizing the reality that if you wait too long to make your point, you lose the chance to make a point. And recognizing that if you get more people speaking and you haven't gone through all these layers, there are going to be more mistakes. People are going to say things, that everybody will wish they hadn't and everything else. But you have to look at the alternative of creating those voids. It's not going to be as bad as what was his name, Matthew Simmons is going to say. That's not a completely good comparison, but recognizing that the alternative is worse and letting people go a little more within, obviously, bounds. Let people who have some expertise speak about their expertise.
Justin, do you have another comment?
Yeah, just to clarify my point on this, on the storytelling and providing more access. All of that, realizing that you are working within a response and a national incident commander, and if you're the expert and you've just come back from a day-long trip going out serving turtles, I would imagine the incident commander may want to hear that information first before he reads about it or hears about it on the TV or radio. So, there's a balance here that you have to find. It's tricky, but I think you can find it in a way that leans more toward being as transparent as possible while still staying within the bounds of what you're trying to accomplish as a national incident command.
I feel compelled to share this anecdote. I apologize. It's kind of a cathartic day for me. I don't know how many times I told everybody that we needed to be transparent. If we couldn't be transparent, be honest about what we could say or what we couldn't say. I don't know how many times I told my commanders that. So in the middle of this spill, we had people that started stealing boom. There was a premium on boom, right? Haul it away, go back and clean it up and resell it. A local, I don't even know who it was. If he's in the room, I'll apologize right now. But a well-intentioned local commander issued a local regulation, which they were legally powered to do, that said you had to stay 50 feet away or some distance away from boom. The Associated Press immediately filed suit. So we were blocking them, and the press didn't have access to the site. That wasn't our intent. We had an officer that's trying to work right. We reversed it. We said, here's a permit. We had to fix it, but it took 72 to 96 hours to fix that. That's what happens when this is going on out there. And these adjustments are really, really hard, and these decisions that people are making are not easy ones. Mm-hmm. But we recover from it. It wasn't like not showing the video, but it's just a case where somebody's trying to do the right thing, and all of a sudden you filed suit. Yeah. Thanks for letting me share.
Okay. Here's a good one. What, in your view, was the media's finest hour during Deepwater Horizon? For example, the moment when they were part of the solution. And then what was the lowest point? For example, when their actions were least helpful. Any thoughts on that? It's a good one.
You know, actually, maybe Ann wants to comment on. We had a really long conversation down in Venice one day about what was going on down there. She had been living down there, and this notion about how you try and reconcile what she saw every day and what she was living down there. And I wasn't down there every day, but I was someplace every day. And it only took one trip out to Bay Jimmy to know that things were not right in Barataria Bay. And I don't have any problem at all having those kind of conversations. And the basic element of the press is to make sure that government does what they're supposed to. And I think there are a lot of moments where they did exactly that, and we should be happy about that. I think keeping the pressure on to have the video of the oil coming out of the well, I think that was all good. On the other hand, I was I was in the Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer one night live, and they played an excerpt from Anderson Cooper the night before with our good parish president from Plaquemines Parish, who questioned my IQ and my qualification for the job and why I hadn't been fired. You know, I wouldn't call that the low point of the thing, but you have to answer that live. You know. And my answer was that I appreciate feedback on my performance. I always have, but I work for the President of the United States, so you have another question.
Justin, you next?
Sure. So I work in communications, work in environmental communications. And, you know, recently the New York Times suspended its environment blog. NPR is down to one environment reporter. You know, we lament the decline in environmental coverage and science coverage all the time. I'm on press conferences where there's 200 reporters on the phone during Deepwater. Man, I couldn't get, lucky if I get 3 on the phone these days. I mean, I think this spill and the coverage on this spill was a finest hour for the press and the environment and science press. It was a 3-month-long environment story that led the news every single day. And sure, there's differences and disagreements and shouting matches and all that kind of stuff, but it's hard to imagine how you're going to get this much environmental awareness on the health of the ocean, our connection to it, the human connection to it, the importance of it. I don't know where you're going to, how often you get that. Not an opportunity, because that's not respectful for what happened here. But I think the entire event was an incredible moment for environmental journalism. So I don't have a low point. There were a lot of low points. There wasn't one.
Anybody else down the line there on that one?
I'll give one high point. It was one that ties into a lot of the other things that have been said. I was impressed when so Richard Harris at NPR. This was when there was the big flow rate issue, and it started out with some small numbers, and people were saying, a lot of scientists were starting to say, and presumably lots of others, and probably people here, that just can't be right. And there were. My memory is dim. I guess I don't know whether it was more BP, but there were voices saying, you just really can't do it, it's et cetera, et cetera. And he got that clip of video and he took it to some scientists himself and found some people that would do it. And that's not quite the level of peer review we're talking about here, but it was kind of, it was speedy in wartime kind of thing, and they weren't that far off. They were in the range, so that was good. Low points, I'd have a long list of 2. I brought up one. The lake of oil just bothered me. I guess just because that was something that I had followed closely to see how twisted something like that could get. Because all of those things at the beginning led to a lot of the sort of downward spiral. So that was kind of depressing.
I made a recommendation to Howard Kurtz on reliable sources on one of the anniversaries of the spill that we need to date and timestamp B-roll.
Yeah. Well, they're supposed to. I mean, when you're using file tape, if you're using file tape, there should be a date up there. It should not be wallpaper.
I'm with you, Ann.
We're getting close to the end. Here's a good one, I think. Can anything be done in advance between government, media, industry, and academia to communicate risks? What strategies can be used in planning preparedness to be better able to answer the questions media anticipates for response. And then the comment, each incident is so specific. Is there a generic approach you can take that might address that? Charles?
Well, looking at the Exxon Valdez, what was done that was effective, and we had a lot of conversation today about why is there not going to be another oil spill in Prince William Sound. It was the creation of the Regional Citizens Advisory Committee. And, industry, Coast Guard, anybody else can take credit for all these improvements, but a lot of the improvements that took place were the result of that group fighting to get those tractor tugs and get those, get that spill preparedness put in place. It's a group of stakeholders who live in there. They've got a stake in that environment, that ecosystem. It's their home. They should be empowered, and they're not given governmental power. They're just given money so they can hire consultants and they can use the bully pulpit to bring light to issues. We can't expect the public, the public in large, to be aware of oil drilling and spill preparedness. I mean, it's just, there are too many issues for us all to be aware of. So if we want to have this kind of understanding of risk and preparedness and have the public and the stakeholders involved, they've got to be given the resources to do that. And there are a lot of good people in all the agencies that work on these issues, but one of the other things we found out in Exxon Valdez was the industry capture of those agencies was a really severe issue, and that the reason that the agencies were asleep at the switch and the spill, the state of Alaska included, was because really nobody's looking over their shoulder, and that the people who are all in that business sort of get the same perspective. The night that the Exxon Valdez hit the rocks, there was a community group meeting in Valdez that was concerned about the danger of these tankers going through Valdez Arm and the amount of ice there. People were not listening to them. Before the pipeline was built, the fishermen in Cordova said, don't ship the oil through Prince William Sound, build a pipeline through Canada. That could have been done. It wasn't done. There was an agreement to put double-hulled tankers on that route. That was made by the Secretary of Interior when the issue was in front of Congress. There was backsliding. Industry said that's too expensive. That's why we didn't have double-hulled tankers. So if you really want to deal with these risks, you have to empower the people who actually are going to pay the cost when the spill takes place. And the way you do that is to commit something like the RCAC. And I talked about this, my book came out right when this had happened. I talked everywhere I could about it because to me it seemed like, hey, we found a solution in Alaska. We created this group, and now we've got this fabulous spill preparedness and prevention. And it's a little bit like if there was an airplane crash at LaGuardia because the pilot fell asleep. So at LaGuardia, you make sure that all the pilots are wide awake. But at JFK and Newark, you don't do anything. You leave it the way it is, right? And I really feel like that's what we did. And if we want the Gulf of Mexico to be safe, we need to take that same approach where the people who are going to pay the price have a seat at the table.
Thanks. Anyone else on that one? We have a number of really good questions, and Nancy, I don't know, we're about ready to be done. I'm going to run one more quick one through. There's an interesting here about embedding the press in the response organization that I'm not going to get to. There's one on impact of litigation on communications, which is a big issue. And then there's this one. Deepwater Horizon changed the way the FOSC and the responsible party could visibly interact in managing the media and message to the public. Although necessary to create the distance for perception reasons, it may have created more challenges to providing the best information in the timeliest way. Where's the sweet spot for the government to capitalize on the information the RP possesses while preventing the appearance of being in partnership with the spiller when communicating to the media and the public? That's one that I know.
I don't think there was anything indicated in the 20 years leading up to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that the model of the responsible party, the state rep, and the federal on-scene coordinator talking to the press at the same time ever didn't work. Mm-hmm. So that was a pretty good surprise. Now, obviously, we're dealing with a large magnitude spill, order of complexity we had not seen before, outrage in the local community and the environmental, disaster that was unfolding. All of that basically invalidated. Remember, I talked about earlier today, I talked about the social and political nullification of the response doctrine. This thing, when things start to scale, just like ICS, you have to go back and suspend assumptions and reassess what you're doing. Whether it's the video, whether it's the the operation of the JIC or whatever. And I think in this case, what was a standard practice, I as a captain of the port, federal on-scene coordinator, I don't know how many press conferences I have held with the responsible party. It was an accepted practice, understood to be the way that you created teamwork around solving the response. But the vehemence and the animosity surrounding this thing basically invalidated the doctrine. And so you have to step back and say, is there another way to do it? That didn't mean we stopped communicating. But I mean, you have to be responsive. If people are that upset about it, then you have to be reacting to it. Otherwise, you're perceived as part of the problem, and your credibility starts to suffer as well.
Anybody else on that one? Nancy is not dashing up to the front. I don't know what that means. One more question. Let's do the one on litigation. I think that's a good one. It says you've not addressed impact of litigation on communication. Has it gotten worse since Valdez? I'd like to answer that one, but I won't because I'm just the moderator, so go ahead.
I was just going to say, how could it get any worse? But and I don't know, so I'd be interested in hearing. But in Exxon Valdez, the lawyers showed up and people couldn't talk, and actually Noah Hazmat were one of the few people who were still willing to talk. And there was even they didn't want to. There was a huge fight about setting up the set-aside beaches. So there were beaches that were left as control to see how effective the cleanup had been. Tiny amount of the whole thing. And there was a desire not to have that information, right? Let's erase it. We don't want to know how well it worked. And that was a big fight. And then as it went onward, there was a huge litigation clampdown on the science and on the people who could talk to you and give you real information. In fact, I remember I had to file a Freedom of Information Act request, and you're probably at the other end of that, an appeal and another appeal to get the results of the test that was done on the hot water wash. And that was the first time that anybody knew that the hot water wash was causing more harm than good. Was a result of that. And it was, I'm sure nobody heard about it anywhere but Alaska, but that took 6 months to get that out. And then it was an issue of scientists are designing a science program to understand this oil spill, and there were symposiums held, and they would get up and say, I can't tell you what I'm studying or what I found out. And so a science program was designed by lawyers. It came out being focused just on damage to individual species without any ecosystem perspective. And then when the case was settled, they were able to get together and say, well, actually, we said we should have the ecosystem perspective, but the lawyers didn't let us. Let's do it now. Well, now it's 3 years later. So the amount of knowledge that could have come out of that $300 million that was spent was so much less because of the litigation. And why was, the lawyers are the bosses, right? So that's why that happens. But if you looked at it from a public policy standpoint and you said, we're going to spend all this money on science, and we're also in litigation, we're going to keep the science secret so we don't tip our hand to the other litigants. Well, that's a public policy decision that you're really making. You're deciding the secrecy in court is really more important than the science program. Well, you could also just make another decision. You could say, our science program is going to be public. The other side can use our science. Would you have lost that much? Would you have lost the value of a $300 million science program if you'd done that? I don't think so. So leadership could just make that decision. There's no law that says you have to keep that stuff secret. Lawyers say that, and it has a huge impact on the credibility of the government, has a huge impact on what you're able to do. Someone in charge can tell the lawyers, no, we're not doing that.
Okay. Others?
I think in general, in the complex issues we're dealing with, this is not just oil spill. In fact, I fear it's probably be more prevalent in cyber event regarding potential liability claims, tort lawyers being involved, exchange information, you act in good faith, all of a sudden you're being deposed. I think there's a lot of hesitancy out there right now across all these complex responses because we're operating in basically an unsure legal ground. You don't know what's going to happen until it's over. You don't know what's going to be part of the discovery process. You can be well-intentioned and do something, all of a sudden find that you're part of a legal proceeding you never even anticipated. You were just trying to cooperate. And it's difficult enough in an oil spill. I fear it's very, very complex in a cyber event because it's the Wild West. There are no rules out there. I think we need to come to grips with it. And I probably, to the point where lawyers would be, the stuff's not done, quit talking about it yourself. But you can't be, it's hard to do the right thing when you feel like there's going to be a deposition hanging over your shoulder.
I think that we're lessons learned from Exxon, and things have improved, and certainly the communications on the damage assessment side are much, much better than they were then. We were at a low point there where we had dueling science throughout the Exxon. It's gotten much better. And a lot of the information that's been collected, and you've heard about it through 2 or 3 of the sessions today, collected for damage assessment has been shared and been made available for other things.
I do believe this. I think there's a problem with continuity between the response and the natural resource damage assessment. I tried as hard as I could to make sure that continuum was held up. Some of the decisions I made to actually direct operations that I could link to the operational response that I knew would help with the NERDA process were all made more difficult because they were separate regulatory, statutory frameworks, and trying to migrate that information across it could inform both of them. I think it's something we really got to look at moving forward.
Okay. Somebody been taking notes? Nancy, I think we're ready to wrap it up, unless there are other questions, but I think we're at a good point to stop. So thank you, panel. Excellent session. I really appreciate it.